Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on e-mobility. What do we need to make e-mobility a reality on the African continent? I'm Jack Ferris. I'm a partner at CDH and will be moderating this webinar on e-mobility. Joined by four esteemed panelists, both internally and externally, and a panelist of different African practitioners, industry representatives, and officials who've worked in government. So as part of CDH's strategic focus on supporting businesses in Africa to understand the fast-moving landscape of decarbonization globally and in Africa, the intention with this webinar is to provide insights to businesses in Africa on opportunities and the associated risk with the development of new industries such as electric mobility by providing perspectives from various stakeholders on the continent that are actively involved in shaping the future of electric mobility on the continent, and by that of contributing to the global efforts to decarbonize the economy or the economies of various jurisdictions and countries, including in Africa. So before introducing my panelists and providing a short prelude to our discussion today, there are some housekeeping rules for the panelists and for the attendees. So in terms of questions, because we want to make this an engaging session amongst the panel members and also yourself, please feel free to ask questions or pose questions in the chat box, and I will either address those questions during the session or at the end of the session. So there will be a Q&A session for about, say, 15 minutes, depending on time. And if we are not able to address the questions during either the duration of the discussion or during the webinar, we will then deal with those questions after the webinar. So then just introducing my panelists for today to talk about the issues around e-mobility on the continent. So the first panelist is Eric Mwangi. Eric was up until recently the economic advisor to the Cabinet Secretary of the Ministry of Energy in Kenya. Eric has 25 years experience in advisory and investment in public, private sector across a number of industries and sectors. He has worked with leading investment companies in energy, helping them build and execute infrastructure investments and execute market entry strategies. So Eric brings a depth of experience from government and private sector in what is currently happening in e-mobility in Kenya, but also in the East Africa region and more broadly the African continent. Then next is Warumo Karanja. She's a partner at Persistent Energy Capital LLC, Africa's climate venture builder based in Nairobi, Kenya. She manages the corporate, legal, ESG and compliance matters at Persistent. She also supports entrepreneurs with venture building services on those matters. She has extensive experience for more than 14 years in climate change, energy infrastructure and private equity matters. And also on her off time, she is an affluent nature lover, hiker, and a bookworm, expected from a lawyer. And next, Martha. Martha is a partner at CDH in our corporate and commercial department, focusing on corporate and commercial private equity matters, and has also depth of experience in advising and assisting multinational companies and companies based in East Africa and Kenya on e-mobility matters. She's been involved in some exciting projects in the e-mobility space in Kenya, both advising from a policy and contractual perspective in rolling out those projects within Kenya. And last but not least is Margot Ann Werner. She is also a partner at CDH in our environmental practice with extensive experience in energy, mining and infrastructure, but also a particular focus on ESG and in the entire value chains of various transactions and projects. So with that, I want to then just start the discussion in respect of why are we talking about e-mobility in Africa, and why are we saying to make it a reality in Africa? And the intention or the statement we made in our invite for this webinar was intentional, make it a reality, because if you look at it from a continental perspective, it is already a reality in the sense that although it's negligible in comparison to what is happening in Europe, in the Americas, and in Asia, e-mobility has taken off on the continent, and the panelists will also unpack that in a bit more detail. But what is the catalyst for e-mobility? Why are we all talking about e-mobility? When we look at the African continent, our contribution to CO2 emissions is negligible. And that is again driven by what is the global move for electric mobility, from achieving not just net zero on the continent, but achieving net zero globally by 2050. And that is part of the commitments under the Paris Agreement on climate change by each country, which includes the African jurisdictions, whether it's Kenya, South Africa, and all other African jurisdictions, in assisting and contributing to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But one of the big questions is, but why? Why do we as African countries have to essentially invest in e-mobility? And those questions, again, needs to be addressed and unpacked, and will be unpacked in terms of how are we creating conducive policy and legislative frameworks for the production and use of electric vehicles on the continent. Why is that needed when we are facing a crisis in respect of what we call or dub energy poverty on the continent, where significant amounts of people on the continent do not have the basic access to electricity? And we, on the other hand, also face with where people have grid connectivity, and we talk about South Africa and Zimbabwe, we have a lack of generation capacity to actually meet the demands of particular jurisdictions. Where is electricity going to come from to essentially propel these electric vehicles? The other dilemma is when you talk about South Africa, you want to use renewable energy for the propulsion of electric vehicles. The majority of the electricity generated in South Africa is fossil fuel. So those are the dilemmas and dynamics from African. When do we start and how do we start? And is there sufficient policy and regulatory measures, including incentives, in place to do that, to ensure that ultimately Africa takes part in the revolution in e-mobility? So now over to the panelists. So that's just the introductory remarks in respect of why we're talking about e-mobility on the African continent. And my first question, Eric, if you don't mind putting on your camera, goes to you, being someone who's been involved in the development of policy. You've seen both sides of the coin from a private sector perspective and a public government perspective. So if you look at e-mobility, the penetration of e-mobility in Africa in comparison to what's happening in Europe and Asia and the Americas is a struggle, as I mentioned. Why is it important for countries in Africa like Kenya to capitalize on the electric vehicle revolution?
Thanks, Jacko. I think the first answer to that is to say that first, there's an inevitability around this, that the world is moving towards e-mobility. And if you look maybe 5-6 years ago, targets were being set at by the countries that are at the forefront of this, which are the Scandinavian countries, EU, for 2040 to basically exit internal combustion engines. For a lot of them, they've been moved up to 2035. Some are even as early as 2032. So what's clear is that, you know, the decision has been made as part of the whole global decarbonization agenda that we are going to move towards electric mobility as a critical component in achieving that. Now, what does that mean for the continent? I think one, there needs to be some careful thinking around at a national level, what is achievable. Because if you think about this, how the sequencing of this would work, you would start by saying, you know, as a country, we have a broader kind of decarbonization climate change plan that has different sectors, and within that plan we are setting specific targets. So that could be passenger cars, or you know, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and saying this is what we'd like to achieve within this time frame. And what would come next is then you would say, so what's the regulatory framework that's required to achieve that? What kind of incentives can be offered to stimulate the necessary activity that would be required to achieve those targets? What are the partnerships that are required, whether it's with OEMs, whether it's infrastructure providers, and then lastly, most importantly, is investment mobilization, and how do you get the significant amount of capital that's required to make this whole ecosystem work. The challenge now from a policy point of view is that, well, that sounds like a very nice orderly way to proceed and to develop the sector. It doesn't necessarily work out like that, because different parts of the value chain are moving at different rates. And the conversation that's happening around the penetration of e-mobility in specific markets and specific regions now is happening almost in parallel around the conversation around global supply chains by the OEMs. So they almost want to know, how are you thinking about mobility evolving in your market, as they're thinking about how they reconfigure their own supply chains. Makes for a very kind of complex set of issues to order. And I think it's almost as if policy has to go in parallel with specific action, where you say, if you've got some clear advantages and you've got some early movers who are saying, we can already see that, you know, whether it's an abundance of renewable energy, or its location, or its availability of the minerals that are required in a manufacturing process, or all of the above, that you will find yourself in a situation where you have to figure out the policy as you are working with the early movers to get things going. So I think that's the dynamic that as policymakers you have to kind of manage, and also on the investment side to say, don't wait for the policymaker to say, we are working on a long-term policy for e-mobility that's going to be ready in 12 to 18 months. So start doing what you can do now to get things moving.
And how does that fit? Just another question on the point is, how does that fit into, from a regional perspective? So you look at Kenya and the policy developments in terms of e-mobility and also regulations, incentives, but you also have countries like Rwanda and Tanzania, also Rwanda, that also has the same type of agenda. If we look at what's happening with VW, how does the regional approach work when we talk about OEMs again, and making sure that the region works with each other in developing the sector?
So I think on the side of the supply chains, global supply chains, and kind of figuring out how to integrate new regions into them. So say Eastern Africa, if you will. I think there it's much easier to make a case for a harmonized approach towards bringing these new, because everybody's got something that they contribute to the table from day one, right? Whether you're the one bringing the power resource, or you're the one bringing the minerals, or you know, you can figure out a way to, because it's also massive in terms of the agglomeration of investments that's required. The one that's trickier is when you're talking about incentives and kind of the regulatory framework. Developing regulatory frameworks for one country, forget for multiple countries and trying to harmonize them, it can take a long time. And also the incentives that are provided normally will be determined at a national level. But I think that my sense is that on that side, on the penetration side, you kind of want to have the early movers just run ahead and see how they succeed, learn their lessons. So in this case, let's say it's Rwanda, because Rwanda are very kind of quick and agile and can move quickly, and you can kind of let them run ahead and see how is it working, what are the results that they're getting. Is that lesson applicable to maybe a bigger and slightly different market like Kenya or like Uganda or Tanzania? So, but I think there's lots of benefit in kind of allowing folks to run ahead and seeing what you can learn from them, and then later on figuring out, okay, what can we have a common position that helps all of us, and that leaves no one behind.
Well, thank you, Eric, for those insights. So Martha, then maybe just touching on what Eric has said. So if we look at, so you've done a lot of work in the e-mobility space, and your interaction also with the changes in policy and development of policy and law, and the contractual issues that you face from the project inception to the funding components to the entire value chain. What has your experience been in Kenya?
Thanks, Jackwell. Good afternoon, everyone. Our experience has been that we have to look at multiple policy documents or frameworks just to be able to advise our clients. As Erica said, there is no harmonized e-mobility policy, and it sounds that it's going to take some time to put one together, and leave alone the policy, even just legislation that governs e-mobility in Kenya. There's no real harmonized one. So you've got to look at different pieces of policies or frameworks. Luckily, we do have a number of those. We've got the Kenya Green Fiscal Incentives Policy. We've got the National Climate Action Plan from the government. We have the National Energy Efficiency and Conservation Policy. And then every year we've got a budget statement from the government that tells us where the government is going with some of these initiatives that it's trying to put in place to incentivize the sector. So it's a bit challenging for lawyers, a bit challenging for investors because everything is all over the place. But there's definitely a move by the government to incentivize the sector. And the clients can rely on us to point them in the right direction so that they don't miss out on anything that the government is doing to encourage them, and so that they can take advantage of what's in place for them. On the legislative side, maybe what I can mention that has been done is that there has been a lot of reduction of excise duty mostly for motor vehicles. And this is something we are hoping we will see being done for four-wheelers. There's been a lowering of tariffs by the KPLC. This is to encourage those who are bringing in EVs and motorbikes to sort of give a good rate for charging to those people bringing in those vehicles. What we've seen as well is in the new finance bill that was just published last week, a definition of what local content means. So for those who are assembling vehicles in Kenya, they get a lower income tax rate at 15% for the first 5 years, and they can get that extended for another 5 years if they can demonstrate that they have local content. and local content has now been defined, that what they are manufacturing is basically locally made in Kenya, at least 50% locally made. So whatever whatever materials they're using to assemble their vehicles or motorbikes, they have to be able to show that at least 50% is originating from here. So, as Eric said, it's different bits and pieces that we are looking at, but luckily, the government seems very cooperative, very interested in assisting people to get into this space. It's just a matter of piecing together what is beneficial and taking advantage of that as much as possible.
Thank you, Martha. Maybe just on one point, talking about if you look at your underground experience with, in particular, the project that you've also been busy with in terms of passenger buses is in Nairobi. What are the learnings that you would from that in terms of either from a contractual perspective or dealing with regulators or dealing with financiers and ultimately getting the funding for those projects for the client?
There's been a lot of learnings, and I think Eric has just said that for investors, we don't necessarily have to wait for the policies, for the regulations to come in. So we've been doing a lot of experimentation, especially on the agreement side, because a lot of this is not legislated in Kenya. So we're sort of setting the path and setting the tone. As to how we will get the government to assist us when it comes to, for instance, even something as simple as registration of these vehicles, or for investors who are getting finance, something as simple as creating security for these EVs. It's work in progress. It's going to be an experiment. We're going to learn as we go about it, but we are sort of like taking charge and sort of, engaging the regulators and telling them this is how we see it should be done. And because it's also new to them, I believe that we'll get a bit of cooperation from them on it. So we're so to speak, leading the way as much as possible and learning as we go. So it's been an interesting
it's part of the process.
Yeah.
And thanks, Martha. So now I'm going to move to Southern Africa, to Margot. And Margot, if we look at what's happening in South Africa, in Southern Africa, and you compare that to the discussion that we had now with Eric and Martha, in terms of the policy and legal framework in South Africa and what's happening with e-mobility in South Africa more broadly, if you can maybe touch on that.
Thanks, Jackal, and afternoons, everyone. So based on what we've now heard about sort of the e-mobility environment in Kenya, I don't think South Africa is really that much different. It's a very similar instance of a very complicated ecosystem, really, having to piece together considerations that will both influence the rate at which e-mobility gains traction in South Africa, and the fact that that will not be an easy task. There are so many stakeholders that will need to be involved in South Africa. Other than that being the general public, are obviously national government and the policies, plans and strategies that we currently have on hand, and whether those in actual fact are speaking to each other in respect of e-mobility and sort of transitioning towards the integration of e-mobility in South Africa. And that's also just coupled with the considerations around decarbonization, and obviously the global and local and regional appreciation to deal with climate change and the role that e-mobility plays there. So, I mean, just on those factors alone, there are many moving parts, all moving at a different rate, all which we need to keep track of to at least have a bit of certainty and maybe a clear view of the role that e-mobility can effectively play. One, I suppose, is being a solution to climate change. I think it's now common knowledge and accepted that e-mobility certainly does present a solution to climate change. I mean, just to give some figures in South Africa alone, the transport sector has in actual fact become or is becoming accounts for effectively 13% of South Africa's total energy-related CO2 emissions, and it is also the fastest growing source of South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions. So there is a lot of abatement, if I can put it that way, that needs to be addressed, and of course a solution there would obviously be in the form of e-mobility. And then, of course, the second consideration is the global movement towards e-mobility and the role that South Africa plays as quite a major player in the vehicle manufacturing sector. I mean, South Africa is synonymous with producing internal combustion engine vehicles. So there's an absolute need to respond to the changes in behavior effectively of South Africa's export market, is particularly Europe. So as to not obviously lose our role in quite a lucrative area of our economy, and to effectively to lose that opportunity. So it's quite vital that again, sort of this ecosystem also addresses how car manufacturers in South Africa, or South Africa, what benefits South Africa can present to car manufacturers to establish a market that addresses what will be the growing demand, particularly in the developed world, for electric vehicles. One, to address their own decarbonization initiatives and commitments, if any, and with those e-vehicles effectively serving sort of as offset measures to their carbon emissions. And in South Africa in particular, again, in sort of trying to piece together sort of these various moving parts and sort of these different considerations, there are a number of policies, plans, and strategies, again, that speak to the establishment of an e-mobility sector in South Africa specifically. And again, just to briefly note, there is a strong link, obviously, to South Africa's commitments under the Paris Agreement, Jacqueline, as you noted at the beginning of the session, and the fact that we have our National Climate Change Response White Paper, we have our Carbon Tax Act, and we have our rather delayed climate change bill, which we obviously are anxiously waiting finalization and implementation of, because I think, particularly in respect to the climate change bill, that will bring a large shift in terms of limitations to certain sectors, and particularly, I think, the motor industry and its associated fuel industry. And with those shifts, and with any implementation of limitations in terms of CO2 emissions, will obviously have a corresponding consequence. But it's very possible to make that consequence of this change very much to treat it as very much an opportunity, but to rather identify that now and start moving now in anticipation, rather than, as Martin Eric noted, rather than waiting on sort of that certainty to to be given by government in sort of the form of sort of clear policy, but sort of keeping that decarbonization drive in mind. We have seen other documents published by government. We have our green transport strategy, and that's a national strategy document that aims to minimize the adverse impacts of transport on the environment, and also speaks to addressing current and future transport demands in South Africa. So this green transport strategy is very much underpinned by sustainable development principles, particularly. We also have, and this was published in 2021, but we had the Auto Green paper on the advancement of new vehicles in South Africa, and I think perhaps that one is one that we are anxiously waiting sort of again progress with, because it quite clearly outlines the steps that will need to be taken nationally to really implement and realize an e-mobility sector in South Africa. And I mean, that includes sort of appreciating what steps and what initiatives and what incentives will need to be put in place to realize that. There's quite a nice list that the Green Paper provides with sort of 4 key points, and I'll just quickly outline those at a very, very high level. But one of those is our current charging infrastructure. This is obviously focusing on the domestic market and the consumer appetite for the use of electric vehicles, and the fact that this needs to be expanded. And I think that will, one, incentivize motorists to switch to electric vehicles, but I mean, we also need to take into consideration that there are perhaps other concerns that motorists would be anxious about in adopting EVs, and that is particularly the current energy security, energy security issues that South Africa is currently facing. And so we would potentially need a lot more comfort to be incentivized to effectively motivate for that increased infrastructure to be implemented. Coupled sort of with that domestic market is to really understand the value chain considerations around carbon reduction in our economy, and that goes very much, and that's very much linked to the shift in the country's energy mix, keeping in mind our approach to a just energy transition. So while we have an increased proportion of renewable energy in the grid, which obviously will ensure that electricity is used to charge vehicles, there again is sort of the consideration that not so much in the back of our minds, I think very much at the forefront, as to that there are potentially more imminent needs for that electricity at the moment, currently just specifically to address our severe deficit. Another item is the principle of a technology agnostic framework. It's recognized that innovation may provide market-driven advantages, and that this might require a policy approach, a revised policy approach. And the technological development may change the price gap between EVs and internal combustion engines. As it currently stands, EVs are synonymous with being very, very highly priced and really only accessible to high-income earners in South Africa. And then just lastly, there's obviously the sort of more benefit, which is the value proposition that e-mobility presents. There's obviously the opportunity for the establishment of additional jobs, stimulation of local industrial capabilities, and the like. But yeah, there are these promising considerations that the green paper presents. But again, it's the work that's required to get to a point where we have some sort of certainty and clarity that these can all work together, all fit together again in this broader scheme or sort of ecosystem of focusing on alternate forms of transportation and moving very much away from our carbon-based behavior at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Margot.
Thanks,
I think it's a mouthful. There's a lot to talk about in terms of the policy and the framework. And maybe touching on that, and it's also maybe linked to a question that has been posed in the chat box. It's a question to Warumu. When we talk about the move from internal combustion engines and using battery electric vehicles or electric vehicles, it requires significant investment in the entire value chain, from the production, which is the production of those vehicles, and preferably those vehicles should be produced or manufactured on the continent, or some of the components should be produced on the continent, to the end users in terms of the charging stations for the end users of those vehicles to be able to charge them at different points. What is your experience in terms of the investment framework and investment considerations by investors that you've dealt with? Not sure if we...
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Hi, Jacob.
Hi.
Thanks for that. And I guess I can start off just discussing a little bit of how we have invested as Persistent and also other investors in the e-mobility sector. And from my experience, as Persistent, we've mostly invested in startups in Africa that have a focus on two-wheeler and three-wheeler transportation. So by two-wheeler, I would say, e-bikes or e-boda-bodas, and three-wheelers are e-tuk-tuks or e-bajajis, as they are known. And how we've seen the opportunity at Persistent is that, and we had a publication last year on the potential for e-mobility in Africa, is we see that as having climate impact, social impact, and economic impact. And that's why our sweet spot is in especially two-wheelers and three-wheelers. Although, and I'll talk about it, we've invested in a company that's also producing four-wheeler cars. And in our assessment, we gauge, what's the attractiveness economically and socially, and what's the attractiveness environmental-wise. And by environmental-wise, I mean, reduction in carbon, use of clean energy, for instance, in countries that have clean grids in Africa. And the potential is very high. We assessed the continent, and so, 15 countries that were at this really great intersection of both social economic impact and climate impact. And if you think about it, we never really think, okay, how much do, say, motorcycles produce vis-a-vis cars? And I was surprised to find out that motorcycles produce about 10 times more hydrocarbons than kilometers than cars. And that is, a function of usage and also the technology used. So there's a huge potential, especially in urban markets. And how we look at our investments is, what can we do to have that social impact as well as climate impact? Now, three-wheelers, two-wheelers, they are simpler, faster mode of transportation. I think you've all seen in our cities, perhaps outside of South Africa, but when you think of boda-bodas in Nairobi or tuk-tuks or bajajis in Dar es Salaam, they are what now is supposed, best transportation when you're trying to avoid the traffic jams that these countries are known for, Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria. And they're also, affordable. well, affordable is relative, but affordable based on some, the mode of financing. An e-bike would cost, if you were to buy it outright, would cost the same as a regular ICE bike, but the cost saving in using clean energy as opposed to diesel or petrol is quite huge. It's about, it's about 20%, over 50% cost saving, and over 80% saving when it comes to maintenance of your vehicle. So economically, it's also very attractive. It creates youth entrepreneurship, youth employment, and that's something that we're very keen on. We've invested in 5 companies actually that have e-mobility as their focus in Africa. You might know of EcoBoda, which is an e-mobility company based in Kenya, and they market 2-wheelers. We've invested in Tree, which is an e-bajaji or 3-wheeler company based in Tanzania. Solar Taxi in Ghana has e-bikes as well as cars. Altec in the DRC has started off as a solar home solutions company, but because of the potential for e-mobility in the DRC and the fact that they have an established supply chain, and they have an established distribution chain, they then started a new business line in e-mobility last year. And we also have a Sobo in Kenya, which is an outboard motor company that's based out of Lake Victoria. And those countries that I mentioned are actually one of the top, some of the top countries in the 15 markets that we looked at. And that I talked about some of the considerations that we make in investment, and hopefully that covers it a little bit. So maybe I can stop there and see if you have any follow-up questions or any questions that have come up in the chat on anything that I have spoken about.
Maybe a specific question, which is obviously very important for investment decision, is incentives by government in charging infrastructure, or infrastructure in particular, and your experience in investing in different jurisdictions. How has that affected that investment consideration?
Okay, so charging infrastructure, so far we've not seen a lot of investment by governments or private sector in charging infrastructure, but they are developing, and I'll talk about them. The models that the companies that I've talked about have 2 models for charging or for battery. One is swapping. So EcoBoda does battery swapping and currently has 3 swap stations in the Nairobi metropolitan area. So, you have 2 battery packs on your bike, and EcoBoda will have a swap station where, if you've done a battery can run for up to 60 kilometers. So, if you're approaching 50, go to a swap station, swap your battery, and there's a charge to swapping. And there's also home charging that other companies have adopted. And of course, home charging still needs, you can charge at home your 2 batteries. You need to know how to charge, and you'll be trained on how to charge as a driver, but swapping will also help, and having charging stations also help to make sure that you don't run out of fuel. Now, we have had companies look at having, swapping stations, but swapping stations are a huge infrastructure. Even though it's a small swapping station, when you think of a startup, that's still quite an investment, because you have to rent a space, you have to buy the charging infrastructure, and have a distribution network of swap stations, which is something that may not be as conducive for startups that are focused on distribution. What we've seen in Kenya actually is that Kenya Power and Lighting Company, or Kenya Power, has, I don't know if the timing is done yet, but they had a request for expression of interest for partners to have swap stations that are powered by Kenya Power. So I think if you go to a not a swap station, a charging station. If you go to a charging station, then you pay the tariff to Kenya Power, but they have a partner. In my mind, the sort of, the networks that we should be looking at and working more towards is, for instance, having several charging stations across the petrol station distribution networks, right? Because everywhere you go, there's a petrol station. And I expect that those partnerships will continue to build.
Thanks, Marumo. Maybe, Martha, if you have anything to add to that in terms of your experience on the charging stations and incentives that investors will look at as posted by Sati Godin.
Thanks, Jackwell. I think for me, that's the one place we haven't really seen a lot of activity from the government, and would want to encourage them to do that. They're the ones who've got the road network maps. They know where all the fuel stations are. They know where the power lines are. They know, or rather they should be knowing, what the cost is for a private person to set up charging station infrastructure. And so giving some sort of incentives or rebates for those private sector players who are willing to go out of their way and set up these charging stations is important. Pulling those lines, pulling the power lines in along routes where there might not be sufficient power for a station, but there is need for a station, is something that we would want private sector players to get some sort of incentive from government. As to what Wairimu has mentioned, ensuring that they do not discourage partnerships with fuel stations would be very key, because we do have rules in Kenya on competition and joint ventures, for instance. So being able to facilitate or encourage those kinds of partnerships, even if it's for a limited duration of time, is something that we are hoping to see.
Yeah, no, that definitely is important, as you say, looking at all of those different factors, and government must hopefully start playing their part. And there's probably a different experience also in South Africa in terms of how that is happening. But we have quite a few questions, and let's see, maybe start with Conrad and ask Eric, maybe he can answer this question more from so there's a question around, and it's linked also to Kenya. So, and Margot, maybe you can touch on it. So I'm going to give each of the panelists just 1 minute to hopefully respond to it, because I think we have a few questions. So what is South Africa? South Africa's biggest market? The EU has overgrown love of fossil fuels as the world speeds into EVs. Kenya and other economies in Africa are experiencing more activity. Can Africa's car makers collaborate? Can Africa's key car markets collaborate to salvage this export market and tap into new ones? Eric, would you be able to give us some of your insights? And then there's another question to that, and maybe you can also, what is the policy and frameworks will countries need to put in place for such collaborations to work? So interlinked to that.
Yeah, thanks, Jacko. I think currently the only two auto manufacturing hubs in Africa are Morocco and South Africa, and those are internal combustion engine hubs. And so, because for the OEMs, the EV platform is fundamentally a new platform, so it's not as if they can, use the existing ICE platform.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why they are saying we might as well then rethink how it is that we are configured globally, and see how to optimize that for this new paradigm that we are moving into. Now, from a policy point of view, I think the first thing that needs to be understood is, what is the thinking in as far as the leading OEMs and their maybe the set of assumptions that they're carrying around as they consider these kind of reconfigured supply chains. Now, if I take the example of VW have already kind of started pronouncing themselves and making investments. I think the last announcement I saw was investing in a couple of large battery storage manufacturing plants in Canada, taking advantage obviously of the North American incentive schemes around local content. Now, this is kind of a hard thing to do as a continent, because again, not everybody is kind of moving at the same pace. So perhaps the place to start is as a region, because in many ways, a lot of these OEMs with global supply chains think of locations as regions rather than individual countries or entire continents. And to say as a region, whether it's East Africa, whether it's Southern Africa, whether it's Western Africa, to say what is it that we offer as a collective that would be attractive to not just a single OEMs, but hopefully a cluster of them, and then see on an individual basis as a country, how can you contribute to a compelling package that makes them take you as a market seriously? And some of that is kind of supply side manufacturing, but quite a bit of that is also how do you build and deepen your own domestic markets. And so it will require some thinking and some movement around functioning consolidated markets that start to look compelling. So if you're talking about an Eastern Africa that is has a harmonized set of rules that can then seek to consolidate domestic demand, and so you're not talking about Kenya with 50 million people and Ethiopia with 100, and then so you're actually talking about 450 million people as a potential market. You start to look a lot more compelling than if you're trying to have individual conversations.
So it's more about the regional value addition and looking at competitive advantages in the entire value chain.
Exactly. Now, and you have to aggregate that now into one common story that says, here's what we can offer an OEM that locates in this region.
That's a thing. Margot, anything to add from your side on that perspective in terms of policies and collaboration?
Thanks, Jack. Well, perhaps on the collaboration point, and I might be overstepping the policy point, but it's sort of just perhaps more in response to the question around the place of the African Continental Free Trade area and what that might present. And I think that speaks to the whole point of collaboration. That's what its purpose is really intended to achieve. There's a full appreciation. Africa is a mineral-rich country, and the e-mobility sector will rely on relatively rare types of minerals that are very accessible within Africa. So it's about establishing those sort of regional relationships between the countries to really sort of achieve a collective benefit for all. You could establish manufacturing nodes. There could be benefits to and cost effectiveness to the production of batteries, again, through accessing raw materials. So I think the African Continental Free Trade Area is is quite material and should be considered in how in the role that it presents in creating sort of these connections between countries to facilitate sort of this e-mobility sector.
Thank you, Margie. That's a very important point on the AFCFTA, and also ultimately about looking at critical minerals that are required for manufacturing. And in particular, the biggest cost is batteries. And if you can produce the batteries on the continent and you have the raw material, why not? Oromo, maybe, I don't know if you have any comments on that and how that potentially also affects investment decisions if you look at the AFCFTA's potential.
Yes, I look at it in two ways. So when you think about supply of raw materials for batteries, in Africa, you think of mostly one country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that I think supplies more than 70% of the global supply of cobalt that is used in batteries. And there are other countries that are in South America, again, developing markets, that supply lithium, which is also a huge component of batteries. And when you think of mining and countries, especially in developing markets, you think of environmental, social, and governance. What does it mean for ESG? The Guardian had a provocative article last year on the curse of white oil, the secret cost of the electric EV movement. I paraphrase, but I remember reading the curse of white oil and thinking, goodness, this is serious, because it is. But when you think of the mining aspects, where the AFCFTA can be helpful is not just in, where the AFCFTA can be helpful is not just in facilitating intra-continental supply of minerals. For instance, if the DRC gets, through the AFCFTA, great negotiation rates from South Africa, then that can be a great deal under the AFCFTA, but also working towards, working groups that can help certain countries develop their laws and policies when they relate to ESG. Companies should also look at that. So for instance, when we're looking at investment, we always ask our companies to check what their supply chain risk is, but you can't really go to the full bottom of the well to check, for an e-mobility company, a small e-mobility company in Africa, to think, oh, well, how does the battery that's coming with my bike compare to labor laws and human rights laws in the DRC? But there is a huge corporate responsibility for bigger companies to do that and to help governments do that, because of the reputational considerations. There was an article, again, about that talked about, it didn't talk about the company, but it talked about the supplier of Tesla had labor and human rights abuses in Africa. The ESG issues. And that exactly, and that got Tesla to look at their ESG policies and to deal with their main supplier. So that those are two aspects that governments and private sector can look into mining for minerals, and also under the AFCFTA.
Thanks, Oromo. Maybe we have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to give each of you 15 seconds to maybe say a final point, and we want to then also thank our panel, our attendees. And there's a few other questions we still will address, but I think we'll probably only be able to address it in further follow-ups. Maybe Oromo, you can start if you have 15 seconds.
Yes, sure. The move to e-mobility is inevitable. The prices of fossil fuels as compared to electricity, especially clean electricity, which is where the world is going, are dramatically increasing. So the attractiveness of electric mobility is there and it's right. But we do need more government action, concerted government action nationally and on the African continent for instance, under the AFCFTA, to make that aspiration a reality. The various speakers talked about investment incentives. We talked about customs and excise duties. Those are some of the issues that we have as investors and our investee companies have. So there's more work to be done, but the move is inevitable. So we all need to get on the bus, as it were.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Winneba. Martha, final words? No, there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, there is a lot to talk about. Thanks. For me, I would say there's a lot of opportunity in this space because it's new. And so, I would encourage investors to get involved and to be encouraged to put their money into this because we can explore and we can shape how the sector will work and how it will be at this point in time when the governments in most countries are still figuring out what to put in place as laws. So taking a proactive view, engaging with the government, engaging with, advisors on what you can and cannot do at this stage, I think would be critical. It's a new space, it's exciting. And so I would encourage everyone to get involved as early as possible.
Thanks, Martha. Eric, final closing words?
Yeah, thanks, Jacko. No, I think we're in an interesting era, and as we think about what is required from a policy point of view going forward, I think it's important to keep in mind that for most countries globally, not just Africa, but most countries globally, we are going into new territory. In the African context, the only two countries that have real experience in global automotive supply chains are Morocco and South Africa. And while that presents a significant kind of ecosystem advantage because you do have existing component suppliers, infrastructure, that sort of thing, it might present a political disadvantage because investing in the new necessarily means disinvesting in the old. And we cannot discount the political economy effects. It's much easier to start from scratch because you're building something that didn't exist before than saying there are some jobs here that are going to have to be lost or reconfigured. People have to be retooled to live in this new universe, and so there'll be some losers. But there'll definitely be way more winners than losers, particularly if we get the policy and regulatory framework right.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric. Margot, last word.
Thanks, Jacko. Last word. Firstly, I think that there's certainly a base, at least, of some sort of enabling considerations in the form of sort of draft policies and strategies that we at least have in hand and that we can continue considering and working on and developing. And I think that's going to be a large part of the work, but at least it's there. We have the base. And I think over and above sort of that enabling policy specifically focused on e-mobility, we must also appreciate that there's ancillary policy. And if I speak to South Africa specifically, we have continuously developing environmental policies and laws. We have continuously developing energy regulatory laws. I bring in very quickly the fact that we have a very quickly growing embedded generation sector, and I think that's going to play a massive role in the realization of e-mobility. So we should keep that in mind that, as our embedded generation infrastructure and initiatives grow, that will absolutely facilitate the realization of e-mobility in South Africa. And we also have our strategic and potentially competitive advantage of certainly Southern Africa playing a role in the hydrogen economy, because hydrogen and green hydrogen do play a role in e-mobility in the form of those sort of sustainable fuel cells. So there's a lot to piece together, but I think, if we can do that and be excited about it and be optimistic about it, and appreciate that it certainly serves towards decarbonization initiatives, and presents an innovation of many industries, specifically obviously the motor industry. Then it's something that we should run with in Africa for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Margot. Yeah, I think we've come to the end of our session, and thank all the panelists. I think it was insightful discussion. It shows that 1 hour is not sufficient to talk about e-mobility and all the issues and policy considerations, including the investment factors that are taken into account by investors in investing in this growing and emerging sector on the continent in different regions. So there might need to be some follow-up discussion, just unpacking a much more narrow point in this. But we thank all the attendees for attending and listening to the panelists, providing some insights on what's happening on the continent, and hope you'll join us again for a future panel on e-mobility or related issues like potentially battery manufacturing and how that should be done. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Visions are desires that flicker between a wish and intent. They are carvings waiting for the artisan's hand. One who is consumed by purpose. One who can bring vision to fruition. Cliff Decker Hofmeyer, incorporating Kieti law from vision to fruition.